Today I'm going to be doing a highly requested comparison video between the DJI FPV and the traditional FPV drone that I fly, and hopefully give you guys a better idea on which one is right for you. I'm a professional travel filmmaker and I got into FPV about 2 years ago just to get more unique and dynamic shots of the locations that I was visiting. There's a lot of pilots out there that are more interested in racing and freestyle, but for me, it's all about the shots. That's why I was so excited when DJI finally announced their DJI FPV. It was like my favorite cinematic drone company finally made my favorite type of drone. I've been flying it for the past few months now in a few different countries, and I finally feel like I've flown it enough to give a proper comparison. The traditional FPV system that I use is the DJI FPV system. DJI is undoubtedly the king of the drone world, so it's basically comparing one of DJI's products to another one of DJI's products. The DJI FPV system is basically the camera, the goggles, and the controller, and then you're able to add it to whatever drone you want. This is the main drone that I fly for longer distances and just freestyle. But I also have a Cinewhoop drone, which is really nice for going through buildings and also getting close to people, because as you can see, if this drone got close to someone, it would really screw them up. But this one, it's just like bing, and you're totally fine. This is an iFlight Nazgul 5 frame, and this is an iFlight ProTech 35. The camera that I use to film my traditional FPV stuff is this GoPro Hero 9. So one of the setups is highly customizable, and one of them, the DJI FPV, is not. I've gotten a ton of requests for this video, so I hope this video answers a ton of you guys' questions and helps you just make a better decision which one you want to buy. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to be talking about is gear. Traditional FPV is first. So you have your drone, you have your camera that goes on top of your drone, you also have a battery here. Then you have the DJI FPV goggles. These are the V1 goggles, but the V2 goggles work as well. And then you have this fat, chunky controller. You'll also need a separate battery and cord to charge up your goggles. All right, so now getting into the DJI FPV drone, you have the DJI FPV drone battery already installed. Then you have the controller, which is way better than the traditional FPV. I don't know why this controller is so big, but I really like the new controller on the new DJI FPV. And then you have the V2 goggles, which again, you're just gonna need a cord hooked up to a little battery. So right off the bat, you can definitely see that the DJI setup is a little bit more portable and easy to set up just because it has less components. And that's something that DJI is really good at, is just making stuff user-friendly. So in the first category, I have to give the point to the DJI FPV. Next up, we're gonna be going over price. The DJI FPV comes in at $1,300. That includes the drone, controller, goggles, and all the little accessories that you need. For my traditional setup, here's how it breaks down. It's about $869 for the controller and the V2 goggles. And the drone that I usually fly on, this guy, the iFlight Nazgul 5, comes in at $350. Then on top of that, you have the GoPro. This GoPro Hero 9 is $400. So the total comes out to $1,619. With that said, you don't really need a top of the line GoPro, so you can swap this Hero 9 for a Hero 6, which has really, really crispy, clean footage too, for about $200 less. And then these normal FPV batteries right here are about $50 for two of them. But the DJI FPV for one extra battery is $160. So in my personal opinion, the upfront cost for both of them are pretty similar. So the question becomes, what is more expensive in the long run when you're actually out using the drone? And another thing to consider, the traditional FPV drone that I always fly on is like top of the line. The thing about traditional FPV is it's so modular and you can do so many different things, so you can go with a cheaper setup. And in my opinion, it's way cheaper to go with the traditional FPV setup because one, these drones are way more durable, so you're definitely gonna crash. That's just how FPV goes. But these are so much more durable, so the likelihood of them breaking is less. And then on top of that, replacing the parts is a lot cheaper too. Like these propellers here, which in my opinion are way better quality than the DJI FPV, these cost like $4 for a full new set, whereas the DJI FPV, they're $15, and there's only one set of them. Like you can't exchange them for different types of propellers. I have absolutely mashed these drones and GoPros, and most of the time, everything is totally fine. Sometimes GoPros and stuff get really up, but that's pretty rare. I think I've only destroyed like 2 GoPros or something. So fixing the DJI FPV is just a lot more expensive. Even if you have DJI Care, it's typically more expensive to fix the DJI FPV than it would be for your traditional. So for this category, I have to give to traditional FPV. Next up is setup, and as you saw in the gear section, there's a lot more moving parts to the traditional FPV setup. As long as you have everything organized, it's not that big of a deal, but it takes a minute to get used to it. Whereas the DJI FPV is super streamlined. You basically have those three main pieces and that's it. There's a little bit of setup time on your phone, but you can pretty much take it out of the box and be flying within 20 minutes. One of the hardest parts about traditional FPV is just getting everything set up. A lot of people just buy a bunch of different components, build their own drones, and then you have to take it to a program called Betaflight and then program it. And then once you finally build it and program it, it might work. It might take a few tries to get it to actually work. That's what I did for my first drone, and while I do see value in doing all that stuff, when you're just trying to film and get cool shots, that is not what you want to be doing. With my first one, it took me about like 3 months to get it up in the air, and I just immediately obliterated it, and it was like the saddest moment ever. Nowadays it's cool because there's so many ready to fly, ready to bind drones. Like this drone right here, similar to the DJI FPV, I just bought it from iFlight and then linked it to my controller and goggles, and it's pretty much good to go. No Betaflight, no building needed. With that said, there's still a few more moving pieces to the traditional setup, and DJI is just completely streamlined. So for this category, I have to give it to DJI. Next up is range. I've already done a range test with this drone, and I got 2,250 meters. I know you can go further with this drone. I've seen other people go further, but for me, that's just what I got. But even at that range, it still does way better than my traditional FPV setup. Because another thing is, with my traditional setup, I don't have a GPS installed, so if I get out of range, the drone basically just falls out of the sky. But knowing that the DJI FPV will come back and return because it has GPS just allows me to go a lot further. And I know with traditional FPV, some people will say you can install Crossfire, you can get a ground station to make it go further, or you can install a GPS. I just don't have any personal experience with that. And for what it is, the DJI FPV is really solid. So I have to give this category to DJI FPV. Next up is maneuverability while flying. This one is pretty easy for me to cover because as far as maneuverability goes in the air, the traditional FPV absolutely blows it out of the water. The DJI FPV, when you're flying it, it just feels like it wants to do more than you can. Like for example, a lot of times I'll go super low over something and then punch up like this. And I do that all the time with my Nazgul 5. But with the DJI FPV, I'll be going, and then all of a sudden punch, and it just won't do anything super fast. And a lot of that is because of the discharge rate of the battery. It just feels heavy when you're flying. And as far as like circling around objects and stuff, the traditional setup is just a lot better because, for one, this drone is just more maneuverable. How it flies, it's less heavy. It just feels like more light when you're flying it. But also because you can use other drones. So the DJI FPV, this drone is what you get. Like this is the drone. But with the traditional setup, you can have a bunch of different drones. So I can have this big drone, I can have this smaller drone, and I can also have like a 7-inch long range drone if I want to fly up to the top of a mountain and down. So it's just way more versatile, and so for this category, I absolutely have to give it to traditional FPV. All right, so next up is versatility. The DJI FPV is one of those products that you get it and that's it. No upgrading, no downgrading, you can't change it. With the DJI FPV system on my traditional setup, you can do literally anything you want. Like I said before, you can have a long range drone, you can have a short range drone, you can have a mid range drone, all on the same goggle/controller system. There's a lot of beauty in how simple the DJI FPV is. You can just get it, you can get it out of the box and be in the air. There is a lot of value in simplicity, but with simplicity, you lose a lot of functionality. Another thing that I'm going to also group in the versatility category is the fact that the DJI FPV has so many no-fly zones. And I understand that these no-fly zones are set there for a reason, and I'm not against no-fly zones, but there's been several times where I knew I was following all the rules. I was in the middle of nowhere, like no buildings, no cars, no people, and the DJI FPV just simply wouldn't let me fly. I just wish there was a better unlocking system for people who know what they're doing when they fly and they're following all the rules. So obviously when it comes to versatility, I have to give it to traditional FPV. Next thing is battery, and long story short, the DJI FPV has a better flight time. It's about 7 to 10 minutes with the DJI FPV, and with my traditional quad I get 4 to 5. That being said, you can buy 6 of the traditional FPV batteries to 1 of the DJI, and it's pretty ridiculous how expensive they are. It's like $160 to buy a brand new DJI FPV battery. And I also have no idea where they got the 20-minute flight time number. but flight time technically is better, so I have to give it to DJI FPV. All right, so the last category and the most important category in my opinion is the video quality. For me as a professional filmmaker, this is by far the biggest thing for me. Unless the DJI FPV is as good or better than the GoPro Plus Real Steady setup that I shoot on now, I can't justify switching over to it. The DJI FPV has an internal recording rate of 4K 60 and 1080 120. Those stats are super solid on paper, and the stabilization is done internally. So the file that you get off the drone is the one that's already stabilized. Whereas with my GoPro, I have to record on the GoPro, then I have to take the clip, stabilize it through a program called Real Steady, and then I finally have the clip. So it's one step that's just taken out. It took me a minute to get ND filters for the DJI FPV, but I finally got a hold of these freewell ones, and they've done super well so far. So what I'm gonna do here is just put the shots side by side and let you guys decide what you think looks best. In my opinion, the GoPro Plus Real Steady just absolutely blows the DJI out of the water. The stabilization is just like almost like magic, whereas the DJI FPV is a little bit shaky like that. The GoPro Plus Real Steady, like no matter how crazy you're flying, it takes that down and stabilizes it perfectly. A lot of that is because it uses your computer to stabilize, so it just has a lot more processing power to stabilize those clips. I've seen a lot of really cool videos filmed on the DJI FPV, don't get me wrong, but all of the cool videos that I've seen are really short clips. So it'll be 2 seconds here, then 2 seconds here, then a second here, then a few seconds here. But the beauty of FPV for me, especially for the work that I do, is these really long drawn out one shots. So I'll start at one side of a hotel, I'll fly in through the lobby, around the room or something, come out, and for longer shots like that, you just can't have these shaky moments like that. It needs to be perfectly stable. So for me, I just can't justify moving over to a less stable camera. Like I said before, the workflow is a little bit faster with the DJI FPV, but I'm just gonna put a few more clips next to each other just to give you guys a better idea.
Now I'm dancing around my living room. I get drunk on the thought of you and I, when you were mine. See your eyes in every stranger. I replay the way that we were till I'm high. No, it's not right. I miss you missing me like you used to, yeah, like you used to. I miss you kissing me like you used to, like only you do. You know the good things are never as good as the bad, and your love is better than anything I've ever had. Oh, I miss you missing me like you used to, yeah, like you used to. I know you're gone, and you probably just forgot me.
As you can see, the DJI FPV does show some promise, and in really good lighting, the camera does a great job. So it makes me super hyped about future versions of the DJI FPV. But for this test, I have to give the advantage to the traditional FPV with the GoPro on top. So to wrap things up, what do I recommend and who do I think both of these drones are for? I'll speak about myself first. Simply put, I cannot justify switching to the DJI FPV. There are a lot of good qualities to it. There's a lot of good things and promising things about this drone. But the fact that, first off, the footage is just not anywhere near what I think GoPro and Real Steady is. And then second off, it's just not as versatile. Like, I can't just randomly switch over to a Cinewhoop like I can with my traditional FPV setup. And for me, that's huge. Like, I don't want to be flying this drone right here 2 feet away from someone. That would sketch me out so much. But with the Cinewhoop, I can. I can't fly this through a building. With the Cinewhoop, I can. It's really tricky to fly this one well really close around a subject, but with my other 5-inch, I can. That being said, I'm really hopeful that will change in the future. DJI is really good about listening to user feedback, and they are the king of the drone world. Like I said, even the traditional FPV drones that I'm flying, they are flying on a DJI FPV system. So I'd really love to see DJI make an air unit that I can install in my traditional FPV drones with the same technology, with a controller like this, and just combine the best of both worlds. In future versions of the DJI FPV, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of improvements, and I'm really excited to see what they do. Basically, if you already fly FPV, it's not an upgrade at all, so stick with what you're doing. But if you've never flown FPV before and you're looking for something to learn on, this drone might be a great fit for you. It takes you pretty much step by step. There's a simulator, there's a couple different modes where you can go normal drone mode, intermediate mode, and then full manual mode. So it takes the learning process and makes it a little bit easier. That being said, there is cheaper alternatives with traditional FPV drones that also kind of do the same thing, but there's a ton of value in just having a drone that works. One of my friends, he's a filmmaker, he's been wanting to get into FPV for such a long time. He's just had so many issues with building drones and beta flight and just not having a drone that flies. And finally the DJI FPV came out and it just flies. Like, there's no setup, you know it's gonna work, and you can just get in the air right away. And there's a ton of value in that. But if you have the money to burn and you're ready for a drone that just gets in the air and lets you fly, the DJI FPV is probably a great option for you. Like I said, there's a lot of good things about the drone, but I think future versions could be a lot better. So I want to finish out this video with just a few recommendations that I think will make the next gen of this drone really, really good. One, stabilization. Either make the footage compatible with RealSteady so you can stabilize it in post, or just upgrade the Rocksteady stabilization so there's not those weird little jitters. And then two, just make it more manual and more powerful. Like I said in the past, like, it just feels like the drone wants to do more than it can. I think that's a lot to do with the discharge rate and the battery. So in future versions, I would just love a more sporty version. I'd also love more options, like maybe if you did a longer range drone and then a Cinewhoop that's small and you can go through buildings, it would help it compete with the traditional setup. The biggest thing for DJI, please give us this controller for traditional FPV drones. This thing just does not do it for me. It's super hard to travel with, it's big, it's clunky, and this one just feels cool and sleek. I'd love to see a traditional FPV air unit with the same technology that you use for this drone. So guys, that is it for this video. I hope this video kind of helps you make a decision on your own, whether or not you want to go traditional or you want to go with the new FPV drone. And let me know what you want to see in the comments down below. I've been trying a bunch of different stuff on this channel, and I really just want to make videos that add value to what you guys are doing. So I appreciate the feedback in the comments down below. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see future videos, and hit the like button down below. It helps me so much with the YouTube algorithm. It's actually insane how much the like button helps. So I would appreciate it if you guys hit that. And thank you for watching. I appreciate the hell out of all of you, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace. Coolest thing about this drone is the freaking noise it makes when it turns on. That's it.